Toronto real estate hasn't exactly come out to the hottest start that we have seen in years past. That being said, in the month of January, things started to see some pretty good momentum. And then with all the economic uncertainty down in the USA, we saw those numbers change drastically through February and now through March. Let's break down the stats for March 2025. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. This is one of the slowest months we have seen in 30 years. And if you are considering making a move in Toronto real estate or don't really know where to start, click on that first link in the description down below or scan the QR code to book a call at any time that works for you. When we talk about Toronto real estate, everybody wants to know how's the market. Well, the market could mean different things to different people. And when we are talking about how it's maybe slow out there or active out there, one of the things to definitely know is depending on who you're asking, finding out whether or not the market is super important. Because if you ask 10 different people, you will get 10 different answers. And what I can say for certain is that when we analyze the data for both buyers and sellers, what we're doing is trying to unpack how exactly that situation could work in their favor for them and to give them a plan on strategy. Let's take a look at those stats for March. And when looking at these numbers, if you're a buyer or a seller in today's market, I will give you some tips as we go along so that you can get a better picture for your specific situation. Let's start here on this article that says Toronto's real estate market is in major trouble amid global uncertainty. And obviously they are looking at the Toronto numbers and Toronto stats, but I really wanted to just start here as this gives a really good indication when we're talking about numbers. If you think about Greater Toronto area, when they talk about market stats for Toronto, they're actually talking about Greater Toronto area. If you're looking at pricing, there is a big difference between the 416 and 905. So 416 is anything with a Toronto proper address. 905 is everything surrounding the city of Toronto proper. And this is where these numbers get so confusing. So if you're a buyer looking in the Greater Toronto area, but not Toronto specifically, these numbers will mean different things to you, also depending on which city or town you're looking in. If you're a buyer looking in the city of Toronto, these numbers will mean something different as well. And the reason I say that is if we take a look at the year-over-year pricing change and overall Greater Toronto area, prices are down across the board for all detached, semi-detached, townhouses, and condo apartments. But here's where things aren't as clear if you're not looking at the numbers specifically. If you're looking for a detached property with a 416 address, prices are actually up year over year 1.1%. And in fact, across the board, if you're looking at something in the city of Toronto, we have seen the highest price in a month of March that we've seen since the peak of March 2022, which was in Toronto. That was the peak for the city of Toronto. Toronto was basically March, April was the two highest months. If you're looking for a semi with a 416 address, prices are actually up 2.6% in the city of Toronto. Townhouses down 2.4% and condos down 1.8%. Now, if we take a look at the 905, these numbers change drastically. If you're looking at a detached with a 905 address, prices are down about 4.3%. Semis are down about 6.6%. Townhouses down just about 4% and condos down about 5%. And that's where you get these totals where when you see these articles that say Toronto real estate is down, essentially what they're saying is across the board, Greater Toronto area is down. But as you just saw in the numbers, not totally the case. So let's take a look at the Greater Toronto area market stats. And essentially average price, as just mentioned, some pockets are up for Toronto, some pockets are down around the 905. Overall, price is down about 2.5%. But if you remember in the previous videos, we've been talking about how 1.1 million has been pretty much average for the last basically 3 years, just under 3 years. That peak was in March 2022, February 2022 for Greater Toronto area, March, April in Toronto, about 1.3 million. So prices are down from basically 1.3 to 1.1 in that time. Now, this is where things do stand out though. Active listings up significantly compared to the last few years, basically double compared to all these other years, up 90% from last year. Total sales down 23%, 5,000 sales. Definitely was not a big sales month for Greater Toronto area. In fact, about half of what we saw in 2022. I did mention we're going to talk about how this makes a difference for you as a buyer, as a seller. If you're a buyer, you definitely have some choice out there. But if you're looking in some of the best areas for the best properties, those are still competitive today. And I get this all the time where a buyer will come and say, I'm looking to buy in this market, in this area for this property type and this budget. And they say, I can't wait to go out there and look at all the properties on the market. Well, typically, if you are looking in some of the hottest areas for the city of Toronto, those properties still remain very competitive, even today in one of the slowest months out there. If you're a seller and you're looking to put your property on the market, essentially at a 5 months of inventory, give or take, 1 in 5 properties are selling. You you have to pull out all the stops in making your property look amazing, presenting amazing, marketed amazing, and then of course price is the third factor. And if you are a buyer or a seller in today's market, click that like and subscribe button because I do have videos for you upcoming on 3 tips for each, and those will be available on the channel. Now, taking a look at the city of Toronto, and as mentioned, it's a very different market than Greater Toronto Area. Overall, prices up 2.2% for the city of Toronto proper. Active listings up about 60%, still pretty high compared to last year, almost double. And sales down about 17.3%, so less than 2,000 sales. This was one of the slowest months on record for March, and if you look at where things were in 2022, you're looking at about half the amount of sales. Last year was also one of the slowest months that we've seen. 5 months of inventory are 4.78, so you're looking around still 1 in 5 properties selling. Condos definitely leading the way there, although condos made up 45% of all sales in the city of Toronto, so about 45% of this 1908 was condos. Look at the monthly sales data. This does tell a nice picture of where things were and where they're headed. Last year in March 2024 was pretty competitive environment, 1.9 months of inventory. This is Greater Toronto Area, so basically just about 12,500 active listings, about 6,500 number of sales. So you're looking around basically 1 and 2 properties selling, average price 1.12. We've been hovering, as mentioned, around that 1.1 mark with some ebbs and flows. For March 2025, almost 23,500 active listings, about 5,000 sales. So essentially 1 in 5 properties are selling, and average price is still pretty sticky around just below that 1.1 million at 1,093,000. And this is where you can see this chart, and we saw this peak for Greater Toronto Area was in February. In Toronto proper, that was more in March and April. They were hovering right around here. And then we saw a big drop off going into July 2022. And essentially we've been basically flat since. And this is something that I keep bringing up in this channel, is how prices are basically flat and not really taking off as of yet. That being said, we saw rates shoot up. We got some stability here. And I'd argue that whenever we get some stability in rates, that's when we start to see the prices start to increase. And we saw that here in early 2023. And then as prices started increasing, then we saw the rates go back up, and that just basically shot down price again. We stayed relatively flat, and what we've been seeing here in a decreasing rate environment is now we're kind of at that crossroads for the first time where rates are starting to get pretty decently low compared to where they were back in 2022. And here's one of the biggest factors that I feel is super important to note, is that when prices dropped way off from where they were on the peak, we were at interest rates of basically where we're at today. And they went from ultra low here up to basically where they're at today. And that's where we saw that drop off. If we do start to see these rates stabilizing or continuing to go down, and we are hearing some pretty good rates out there in and around that 4% range, that's where we may start to see some increasing in pricing Greater Toronto Area wide, and especially in a city like Toronto. If we take a look at the benchmark pricing, and this is where you can see all these numbers here and some different points as we've gone along. February 2022 in general and March 2022 is where we saw those peaks Greater Toronto Area wide, depending on property type. And then as you can see here, things have been kind of relatively flat since across the board. If we take a look at Toronto proper, same kind of story. February 2022 was the peak for detached, March 2022 was the peak for semis, May was the peak for townhouses, and April was the peak for condos. And you can see where things are at now compared to where they were then. What's interesting is you can really see the drop off in pricing from the peak of the market to now, but then we did see most of that drop happen in the first part right after that peak hit, and then we've been kind of ebbing and flowing since. In fact, semis are up from where they were at the end of 2022, and same thing with detached from where they were at 2022. So interesting to note that semis and detached are still performing very well in the city of Toronto. Now let's take a look at Toronto detached. As we just mentioned, active listings 2,156, sold 572. So that's a really good amount of sales for detached in Toronto. In fact, highest we've seen in the last few months. Months of inventory 3.76. So that's definitely starting to get absorbed more. Now pricing is down from February, interestingly enough, and we'll see how things play out into April. I do predict that we will start seeing some more detached properties coming to market here as the weather gets better, because detached properties, it is nice to be able to get out there and walk around the property, and especially when it's nice and hot and sunny, or maybe not hot, but at least sunny. And we haven't really had that kind of weather as of late. So I do feel that if there are some really nice detached about to come to market, they should be coming here into the early weeks of April and into May. Average price is up from January, but again, down from February. Semi-detached, same story. Active listings 432, which is a good amount. And we saw some better product coming here at the the end of March and into April. 200 sales. So again, 1 and 2 are selling. Pretty consistent of where we typically see. Now, this is one thing that stands out is semis are actually $200,000 more expensive in March than they were back in January. And that's pretty common because I would say there's probably some better semis coming to market as the weather is getting better and more of the stuff that's fully done and turnkey, which will drive those prices up. But at 2 months of inventory, you are going to be in a competitive environment for semi-detached properties. If we look at townhouses, and this is where we're seeing towns still perform pretty decently well, but a lot more have come to market as of late. 205 active listings, 59 sales. Months of inventory at 3.5, but pricing definitely up considerably from where things were in January, up around basically $100,000. So big jump here for towns if we're comparing to January 2025. And then we look at condos, and this is what's so interesting about condos is they've been hanging in there pretty decently well. We saw over 900 condo sales, which is definitely higher than what we've seen in the last couple of months. There are more listings on the market now, about 5,600 active listings in Toronto proper. Essentially, we're relatively flat. Months of inventory around 1 in 6 have been selling. Pricing hanging relatively strong. So even though prices are down from February, they're not down by a ton. In fact, they're down less than 1% from February to March. However, they are up from January. So if you are looking for a condo in the city of Toronto in a Toronto proper address, especially in the best locations, we are still seeing those properties sell, and we're seeing some of them sell pretty quickly if they stand out, if they're presented really well, and if they're priced for today's market value. Now, speaking of condos in one of the most prominent areas, Toronto CO1, which is the major downtown core, 1,500 active listings, 200 sales. So again, this is the most sales we've seen in the last few months, about a month on market on average, and months of inventory, 1 in 7.72, which means that we are very much in a buyer's market for condos. But as mentioned previously, the ones that stand out and are best located and are priced well are still moving, and a lot of them are moving pretty quickly. If we look at CO8, which is just to the east of Yonge Street, still in the downtown core, 911 active listings, 100 sales. So sales remain relatively flat February to March, but listings are definitely up. About 1 in 8.5 are selling right now. So 1 in 8.5 to 1 in 9 are selling right now, and average days on market about 30. So just a snapshot of how these two markets in the downtown core are still very much in buyer market territory for condos. But if you're a buyer looking to get into the market, this presents a lot of opportunity. And when you have your checklist of everything you want, start from the most amount of check boxes you can tick and then work your way from there, especially with what you can afford within your budget. That's your full market update. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below on if it's what you expected for March of 2025 and what are you anticipating in April of 2025. I'm Michael Ouzas. Thanks for watching.